Call came at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been awake since 5, sitting at my kitchen table in Halifax with a mug of tea that had gone cold. Going over the closing documents one more time. I do that. I check things twice, 3 times, 4 times. It's a habit I picked up somewhere between my first year of working in property management and the moment I realized nobody else in my family was going to be careful about anything. My phone buzzed on the table. My uncle's name. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken since Christmas. And even then, it had been the kind of conversation where you're both performing pleasantness for the benefit of everyone else in the room. But I picked up because some part of me still believed that when family calls at 6:47 in the morning, it means something is wrong. Something was wrong. Just not the way I expected. Your parents' place, he said without hello. I need you to know I'm handling it. I didn't say anything for a moment. I looked at the stack of papers in front of me. The deed. The transfer documents. My name on every single page. Handling what? I said. He paused. That small, practiced pause of someone who's rehearsed a conversation and suddenly realizes it's going differently than planned. The property. There's some issues with how it was set up. I've been talking to your parents about getting it restructured. I set down my mug very carefully. When did you start talking to my parents about their property? Cecily. He used my name like a tool. Warm. Reasonable. The voice of someone who is explaining something complicated to someone simple. This is a family matter. Your parents are getting older. These things need to be managed properly by someone who understands. I understand, I said. I bought it. I should back up. My parents came to Canada from the Philippines in 1989. My dad worked as a machinist in a plant outside of Moncton for 22 years. My mom cleaned offices and later worked the front desk at a dental clinic. They saved everything. They spent nothing they didn't have to spend. When I was 12, we took our one and only family vacation. 4 days in PEI, staying at a motel that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. And my dad talked about it for months afterward like we'd been to Paris. They deserved better than that. They always deserved better than that. I got my real estate license at 24, moved into property management, eventually started doing consulting work for a firm in Halifax. I'm not going to pretend I'm wealthy. I'm not, but I'm careful in the way my parents taught me to be careful. And over 7 years, I had managed to save enough, plus a chunk from a small inheritance left to me by my grandmother on my mother's side, to do something I had been planning since I was probably 19 years old. I bought my parents a house. Not their house. They'd been renting a 2-bedroom in New Brunswick their entire lives. I mean, I bought them a house outright. A small bungalow in Cape Breton on the water, with a garden in the back and a covered porch that faces east so they get the morning light. 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, a neighborhood where you can actually hear birds. $418,000. Every dollar of it accounted for. I structured the purchase myself because I know how these things work. My name is on the deed as the primary owner. My parents are listed as life tenants, which means they have the legal right to live there for the rest of their lives, and nobody can remove them, and nothing can be done with the property without my signature. I did this deliberately. I did this because I know my family. I drove up in October, a week before their anniversary, with a card and a printed photograph of the house and a set of keys in a small wooden box I'd found at a craft market in Dartmouth. My mom cried for 20 minutes. My dad kept clearing his throat and looking at the ceiling. My mom made arroz caldo even though I'd told her not to make a fuss. And we sat at the table and the light came through the window at that particular late afternoon angle and I thought, okay, this is the thing. This is the thing I was supposed to do. We moved them in the following weekend. And then I went back to Halifax, back to my job, back to my cold tea mornings, and I thought it was done. I did not think about my uncle. My uncle, my dad's younger brother, had come to Canada about 15 years after my parents did. He married a woman from Ontario, settled in Mississauga, worked in insurance. He'd always had opinions about my parents' choices, about money, about the right way to do things. When I was growing up, I used to hear him at family gatherings, speaking in that particular tone men use when they believe their confidence alone constitutes expertise. He'd never offered my parents anything. Not a loan, not a weekend of help when my dad had his knee surgery. Not even a phone call when my mom was in the hospital 2 years ago with a respiratory infection that scared all of us badly. But he had opinions. Constant, detailed, thoroughly useless opinions. I hadn't considered that he might act on them. After that phone call, I drove to Cape Breton that same day. 4 hours. I'd barely slept. I stopped once for gas and a coffee I didn't taste, and I spent the whole drive reconstructing every conversation I could remember, trying to figure out how far back this had started. When I pulled up to the house, his car was in the driveway. He drives a silver Audi. It was parked at an angle, the way people park when they're comfortable in a space they've decided belongs to them. I sat in my car for a moment. The porch light was on even though it was 2 in the afternoon. I could see through the front window. Shapes moving. The flicker of the television. I took my folder of documents off the passenger seat, put it under my arm, and went inside. My mom was at the kitchen table. Her hands were folded in her lap, which is what she does when she's trying not to cry. My dad was standing near the back door with his arms crossed, looking out at the garden, and he didn't turn around when I came in. My uncle was sitting at the table across from my mom, papers spread in front of him. His wife was on the couch in the living room scrawling her phone. She looked up at me when I walked in, and her expression was not one of surprise. It was something else. Something that had already made a calculation. My uncle looked up. "Cecily," he said, same tone as the phone, warm and reasonable. "I'm glad you're here. We were just talking about getting ahead of some estate planning." "Whose estate?" I said. "Your parents." He gestured at the papers. "The way this was set up, putting the property in your name, it creates complications for them down the road. Inheritance tax implications, probate, transfer issues. I've been talking to someone, and the cleanest solution is to have the ownership restructured. Shared title, more people on the deed." I looked at my mom. She looked at the table. "More people on the deed?" I looked at the pot alum. She looked at the table. "More people," I said. "Like who?" He opened his hands. "Reasonable, patient, generous." "Well, myself. Possibly my wife. Just to ensure there's proper oversight if something happens. Your parents aren't getting younger, Cecily, and—" "Stop." He stopped. I put my folder on the table. I opened it. I took out the deed, the actual deed, the registered one, the copy from the Nova Scotia Registry of Deeds, and I set it in front of him, and I put my finger on my name. "I own this property," I said. "My parents have life tenancy, which is registered and protected. There are no inheritance tax implications because I bought this property with my own money, and it is mine. There is no estate to plan because my parents don't own it. And there is nothing to restructure without my consent, which I am not giving." My uncle's expression went through several phases very quickly. First, surprise. Then, recalibration. Then the particular kind of irritation that belongs to people who are accustomed to being listened to. "You're being defensive," he said. "I'm being accurate. This is a family conversation. You called me at 6:47 in the morning to tell me you were handling a property that belongs to me," I said. "That is not a family conversation. That is you making decisions about my asset without my knowledge or consent." My aunt stood up from the couch. "Cecily, your uncle is only trying to help. You don't have to be so. I'd like you both to leave," I said. It came out quieter than I expected. Flat. Not angry. I was not angry, actually. I'd passed through angry somewhere around Truro on the drive up, and by the time I got to the house, I was just very, very clear. My uncle tried one more approach. The disappointed one. The "I'm only thinking of your parents" one. And I let him finish, and then I said, again, that I would like them to leave and that anything further could go through me directly, in writing. He gathered his papers. He didn't look at my parents when he left. His wife clicked her way across the floor in her boots, and the door shut behind them, and the house was very quiet. My mom let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for hours. My dad turned around from the window. His eyes were wet, and he was trying not to show it, so I looked at the table instead. "How long have they been here?" I asked. "Since yesterday," my mom said quietly. "He called Thursday and said he wanted to visit. He said he had documents." Thursday and said he wanted to visit. He said he had documents. Thursday. He'd driven from Mississauga to Cape Breton, 9 hours, with documents. He planned this. I sat down at the table. My mom made tea without asking. My dad sat across from me, and we didn't say much for a while. Just the sounds of the kettle and the radiator and the birds outside that I wanted them to be able to hear. After they went to bed that night, I sat on the covered porch facing east, and I worked through what I needed to do. I called a lawyer the next morning, a real estate and estate lawyer I'd worked with before in Dartmouth. I explained the situation. She confirmed what I already knew. The life tenancy structure was airtight. There was nothing my uncle could have done, even if my parents had signed anything, because any modification to ownership would require my signature notarized, and my parents had no legal authority to add anyone to the deed. Whatever documents he brought were, at best, pointless. At worst, they were designed to confuse my parents into thinking something was possible that wasn't. She also pointed out something I hadn't fully considered. If my parents had signed anything in that house, thinking it was legitimate, it could have been used to cause problems, even if it held no legal weight. Confusion, lawyers, time. The specific kind of harm that comes not from being right, but from making someone defend that they're right. That was what he'd been counting on. I wrote my uncle an email that day. 3 paragraphs. No accusation, no emotion. The first paragraph outlined, factually, the ownership and tenancy structure of the property. The second paragraph stated clearly that any future communication regarding this property was to come through me, not my parents, and to their personal email address I provided. The third paragraph said that I would be consulting legal counsel if any further attempt was made to involve my parents in decisions about this property. I CC'd my lawyer. I didn't hear back. I stayed for 5 days. On the second day, my mom asked me to walk with her to the water. The beach there isn't sandy. It's rocky, the Nova Scotia kind, gray and cold and beautiful in a way that takes a few minutes to settle on you. We walked slowly because her knees aren't what they were, and she held my arm. And at some point, she said very quietly that she hadn't said anything to my uncle when he first called because she didn't want to cause trouble. I didn't say anything for a moment. "You're not the one causing trouble, Mom," I said finally. "I know," she said. "I know that." She was looking at the water. "I'm sorry we didn't call you sooner. You don't have to be sorry. We were scared," she said. "He made it sound like there was a problem, like something wasn't done right. You know how he talks." I did know how he talked. We walked back to the house and my dad had made pancakes, the kind with blueberries he'd found at the farm stand at the end of the road. And we ate at the table with the morning light coming through the east-facing window, and I thought about how he had driven 9 hours to sit in this kitchen, with documents meant to undo something I had spent 7 years building, and how he had left empty-handed. On the 4th day, my parents and I sat down together, just us, and I walked them through the ownership structure one more time, slowly, with the actual documents. I wanted them to understand it not as something I'd handled, but as something they could explain to anyone who asked. I drew a diagram. My dad photographed it with his phone. My mom asked 3 clarifying questions, and I answered all of them until she nodded in the particular way that means she actually understands, not just that she's done asking. Then we put the documents back in the folder, and my mom made arroz caldo again, and my dad told a story about a colleague from the plant that he told at least 6 times before, and I laughed anyway. I drove back to Halifax on a Sunday. The last thing I saw before I turned out of the road was my dad on the porch, coffee in hand, looking out at the water. Not doing anything. Just standing there on his own covered porch in a house where nobody could tell him to leave, watching the Sunday morning come in off the Cape Breton coast. I had to pull over twice on the highway. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I have thought a lot, since then, about what my uncle was actually trying to do. I don't think it was purely financial, though I'm sure getting his name on the title of a $418,000 property would not have been a hardship for him. I think it was something more about order, about who counts as the person who understands things, who gets to manage, to oversee, to be the one with the documents. He had never once offered my parents help, but the moment there was something real, something owned, something with value, he showed up with paperwork. I've met that pattern before, not just in families. What I've learned, in property and in everything else, is that the people who arrive after the work is done with opinions about how it should be restructured are not the people who were there for the work. And I have no obligation to rewrite something solid to accommodate someone who wasn't in the room when it was being built. My parents have lived in that house for 8 months now. My mom planted tomatoes in the garden last summer and sent me a photograph of them every single week. My dad joined a woodworking group that meets Tuesday mornings at the community center down the road. He made a small shelf for the hallway, and he called me to tell me about every step of it in detail. And I sat on my kitchen floor and listened to the whole thing. Last month, my mom told me my uncle had called once, a few weeks after everything. She said he'd been apologetic. She said she'd listened politely, and then said she had to go because dinner was on the stove. She's the most gracious person I know. I did not get that from her, but I got everything else that matters. There's a quote I've come back to since all of this happened. Something a colleague said to me years ago that I didn't fully understand at the time. The most expensive mistake you can make is letting someone else's confidence substitute for your own preparation. I think about that when I look at the deed, when I look at the life tenancy clause, when I think about the folder I carried into that kitchen and put on the table without shaking. My parents worked for decades so I could have a life where preparation was possible. I used that preparation to give them back something solid, something no one can walk in and restructure. That's not a transaction. That's not a gift even. That's just what you do when it's your turn. If you're dealing with something like this, a family member who arrived with documents, with confidence, with someone else's address at the top of the page, the thing I want to tell you is get your own documents in order first. Know exactly what you own and how you own it. And when the moment comes, you won't need to raise your voice. You'll just put it on the table. I've thought about what I would say if someone asked me whether it was worth it. The 7 years of careful saving, the spreadsheets, the legal structure I spent weeks researching because I wanted to do it right. The 4-hour drive on no sleep, walking into that kitchen and putting a folder on the table in front of a man who had driven 9 hours to take something that wasn't his. It was worth it. Every part of it. But I don't think the worth comes from the outcome. I think it comes from what the whole thing revealed. About preparation, about what happens when you build something properly versus when you build it fast and hope nobody looks closely. My uncle showed up with confidence. I showed up with documents. Those are not the same thing, and I think people confuse them constantly. Confidence is loud. It fills a room. It calls you at 6:47 in the morning and uses your name like a tool. But it doesn't have a notary stamp. It doesn't have a registered deed. And when you set the actual paperwork on the table, confidence has nowhere to go. That's not luck. That's what happens when you do the work before the crisis arrives. I think about my parents a lot. What they built over 35 years with almost nothing. The discipline it took. The things they went without. They modeled something for me that I didn't fully understand until I was an adult sitting across from someone trying to undo it. That integrity isn't about what you say in a hard moment. It's about what you prepared before the hard moment existed. My dad never raised his voice at my uncle. My mom didn't argue. They just waited, with folded hands, for someone who had done the preparation to walk through the door. I was that person. I want to be that person consistently for the rest of my life. There's a version of this story where I didn't structure the deed carefully, where I put it in my parents' name outright, thinking that was the more generous thing to do. My uncle would have had a real argument then. The situation would have been genuinely complicated. My parents would have been caught in something they couldn't navigate on their own, and I would have had to watch that happen. That version kept me up at night for about a week after everything settled. The near miss of it. What I know now is that doing something right for someone you love means thinking further ahead than the warm feeling of doing it. It means asking the uncomfortable questions before anyone else does. It means being the person who already has the answer when the challenge arrives, so that the challenge, when it comes, and it often comes, lands on preparation instead of hope. My parents are 8 months into the house now. My mom has a garden. My dad has a woodworking group. The morning light comes through the east-facing window exactly the way I imagined it would when I first walked through the place. Nobody is restructuring anything. That's what I want to leave you with. If you're somewhere in the middle of doing something hard and right and slow, keep going. Do it properly. Get the documents in order. The people who arrive after the work is done with opinions about how it should have been done differently are not the people who were there for the work. You don't owe them a revision. You owe yourself a foundation. Build the foundation. The rest follows.